Spring storms hit the valley differently than winter ever had. Winter was honest. It arrived with cold, settled over the mountains, and asked nothing except endurance. But spring was deceptive. It gave people soft mornings, the smell of thawed earth, the false promise that the hard season had passed. Then, without warning, clouds would pile over the ridgeline, dark and heavy, and the whole sky would turn like a living thing. That was the kind of night it was when Officer Ethan Cole drove the old county utility road toward the mountain. Rain struck the windshield in violent bursts. Wipers swept frantically, barely keeping up. Headlights cut through sheets of water and mist, flashing across pine trunks and rock faces on either side of the road. Below the mountain, the valley town was already disappearing behind a curtain of storm and darkness. Scattered lights glowed faintly through the rain, warm and small, and unaware of what was waiting above them. Ethan kept both hands steady on the wheel. He sat forward the way people did when the world narrowed and every sense moved closer to the surface. 38 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, and composed even when conditions turned ugly, he carried himself with the same contained discipline he had worn in uniform years earlier. The badge on his jacket had changed. The habits had not. He still scanned constantly, still measured silence, still trusted the part of himself that noticed what others missed. Beside him, Shadow stood braced in the rear cargo area of the SUV, massive paws spread for balance as the vehicle climbed the switchback road. The German shepherd's ears were high, his dark eyes fixed beyond the glass, alert to something Ethan could not yet see. Shadow was not restless in the ordinary way. He was focused. That mattered. Ethan glanced at the mounted radio clipped to the dash. Static crackled, then Captain Maria Hayes's voice came through, thin but controlled. "Cole, say again, you're certain the signal originated from the relay station?" Ethan keyed the mic. "That's what dispatch trace gave me. Old emergency beacon frequency. It hit once, went dead, then hit again. Same coordinates." "Station's been condemned for years." "I know." A beat of static. Then Maria again, calm but edged. "Storm runoff is already pushing the south culverts. If that beacon is live, I want eyes on it. No heroics. You get in, check it, report back." Ethan's gaze stayed on the road. Understood. The radio went silent. Shadow gave one low sound in his throat. Not a bark, not anxiety. Recognition. Ethan looked at him in the rearview mirror. "You feel it too?" Shadow's ears twitched once. The county road curved hard around an outcropping of granite. Beyond it, on a narrow shelf carved into the mountain, the relay station finally came into view. It was little more than a dark shape against darker stone, half buried in weather and neglect. A chain-link perimeter fence leaned inward in places where snow loads and time had bent it. The main concrete structure sat low and square against the slope, with an old communications mast rising above it like a broken rib into the storm. One exterior light over the service entrance flickered irregularly, a weak orange pulse in the rain. Ethan slowed the vehicle and parked just outside the ruined gate. For a moment he didn't move. Rain hammered the roof. Wind drove through the trees with a long, hollow force that made the whole mountain sound alive. The station looked abandoned, but abandonment had a certain stillness to it. This place did not feel still. It felt suspended, as if something had been disturbed and was waiting to finish happening. Ethan killed the engine. Immediately the world sharpened. He opened the door and stepped into cold rain. It hit his face and neck like thrown gravel. Shadow leapt down from the back and landed beside him, powerful and silent. Even soaked in seconds, the dog held himself with military precision, head up, body slightly forward, reading the night. The signal tracker on Ethan's phone showed a weak residual ping from somewhere inside the structure. He pulled a flashlight from the SUV, thumbed it on, and nodded once toward the building. "Let's go." They crossed the broken yard together. The fence gate groaned in the wind. Gravel shifted under Ethan's boots. Water ran in narrow streams down the concrete incline toward the valley, vanishing through old drainage grates at the station's base. The closer he got, the more details emerged in the flashlight beam. Rust running down exterior bolts, cracked warning signs, old county seals faded nearly white, and beneath it all, the unmistakable smell of wet metal, ozone, and deep stone. Shadow paused at the entrance. The dog lowered his head, nostrils flaring, then looked sharply to the right where the station wall met the mountainside. Ethan followed the glance. Nothing visible except rainwater coursing past rock. But Shadow did not move until Ethan had seen it too, a faint rhythmic vibration under the concrete, subtle enough that most people would have mistaken it for thunder traveling through the ground. Ethan crouched and set 2 fingers against the wet surface. The vibration came again, not weather, pressure. He rose slowly and looked at the sealed steel door ahead of them. This isn't just a beacon. Shadow stepped closer to the threshold, waiting. Ethan tried the handle, locked. He swept the flashlight across the frame, found the emergency mechanical override box, half torn from the wall, and pried it open. Inside, the manual release lever was rusted, but intact. He leaned his weight into it. Metal protested, then gave with a violent clank. The door opened inward 3 inches, dragging against a warped floor. A breath of cold air escaped from inside, not fresh rain air, but trapped air from underground. Damp concrete, old wiring. The mineral scent of tunnel water. Ethan drew his sidearm, then shook his head at himself and holstered it again. If this was what he thought it might be, a gun would be useless. He widened the door and entered. The beam of his flashlight cut across a narrow operations room coated in dust and damp. Dead computer terminals lined one wall. An overturned chair lay near a bank of analog switch panels. Water dripped steadily from a crack in the ceiling into a shallow puddle on the floor. In the far corner, beneath a broken monitor, a red emergency beacon box stood open, its glass cover shattered from the inside. Shadow moved ahead, nose low, weaving through the room with controlled urgency. Ethan took 2 slow steps forward and stopped. On the central operations desk sat a waterproof case, not tossed there, placed. The case was olive drab, military grade, scarred but still sealed. Across the top, written in black marker, were 4 words. For Ethan Cole only. The storm vanished for a moment. Not outside, not in reality, only in him. His hand did not rise immediately. He stared at the writing with the stillness of a man who had spent too many years learning how to absorb impact without showing it. Shadow returned to his side and looked up once. Ethan exhaled slowly. There were certain kinds of handwriting the body recognized before the mind let itself believe. Certain names that did not fade just because years or death stood between then and now. He set the flashlight upright on the desk. Its beam threw long shadows across the ruined room as he unclipped the case latches. Inside were laminated maps, folded structural schematics, 2 notebooks, a digital recorder sealed in a plastic pouch, and a county emergency keycard attached to a tag. Beneath them lay a single photograph. Ethan picked it up. It showed 2 younger men in Navy rain gear on the deck of a ship somewhere under a hard white sky. One stood rigid, even in mid-laugh, shoulders squared, trying not to smile and failing. The other leaned into frame with the easy confidence of someone convinced bad weather was a personal joke. Ethan closed his eyes once. Jonah Mercer, brother in everything but blood. The man who used to tell him that if the world ever got too loud, there was a valley tucked into the mountains where the air still felt clean. The man who had described these ridgelines, these roads, these storms years before Ethan had ever seen them. The man who had once said in the casual voice of someone hiding sincerity behind humor that if anything ever went wrong up here, Ethan was the only person he would trust to finish what mattered. Mercer had been dead 9 months. An avalanche during a winter survey detail, that was the official report. Buried when a maintenance section above the reservoir failed under unstable snowpack. Recovery delayed, then closed. Ethan had read the report once and never read it again. Shadow put both front paws lightly against the desk and sniffed the open case. Ethan reached for the recorder. His thumb hovered over the power button for 1 heartbeat longer than necessary, then pressed it. Static. Then Jonah Mercer's voice emerged through the ruined room, roughened by fatigue, but unmistakable. If you're hearing this, you made it to the station. Ethan's jaw tightened. I'm going to assume 2 things. 1, you ignored common sense and came alone. 2, Shadow's with you, which means your odds are better than mine were. Ethan almost laughed. Almost. The recording continued. Listen carefully. This isn't about the station. The relay beacon is just bait. What matters is under it. A paper rustled on the recording. Somewhere behind the voice, water echoed. The flood control tunnels beneath the valley have been failing in sections for months. Not surface damage, internal pressure decay, old wartime construction, bad retrofits, deferred maintenance, too much snowpack, too much spring water. I found fractures in the diversion line and movement in the lower gate housing. If the main shaft jams under peak runoff, the reservoir will punch straight through the south tunnel and into town. Ethan grabbed one of the maps and spread it open across the desk. Blue lines, pressure channels, inspection routes, handwritten notes in Mercer's precise block letters. Several locations were circled in red, and one phrase repeated twice. No time once. Surge begins on the recorder. Mercer kept talking. I tried going through official channels. Too much delay. Too many people assuming the numbers could wait until summer. They can't. I started patching what I could, rerouting where possible. Bought some time. Not enough. The voice paused. When it returned, the humor was gone. If the station beacon activated, it means chamber pressure crossed the threshold I set. That means the mountain's already moving. Ethan, if it's tonight, there's only one way to stop it. You have to reach the main control shaft through the old maintenance route. The route markers are in the case. Follow them exactly. Don't trust the newer access map. Half the modern entries are unstable. Ethan looked up at the room around him, at the dark walls, at the storm beyond the door. Mercer's last words on the file came slower. I'm sorry. I wanted to handle this before it ever reached you. But if you came, then I failed at that part. So hear me on the rest. Don't waste time grieving me. Save the valley. The recording clicked off. For several seconds, there was only rain against concrete and the soft drip from the ceiling. Shadow rested his head briefly against Ethan's thigh. It was a simple gesture. Weight, warmth, presence. Ethan placed one hand on the dog's neck, fingers pressing into wet fur. There it was again, that old instinct to fold feeling into motion, to seal pain behind function, and keep moving because motion was cleaner than grief. Easier, safer. But Mercer's voice had cut through more than memory. It had placed something in Ethan's chest that could not be postponed. Not this time. He took the key card, one notebook, the maps, and the recorder. Then he keyed his radio. Captain Hayes, I need Lena at command now. Maria answered quickly. I'm here. Talk. Ethan's tone sharpened into work. This isn't a false alarm. The station contains structural records. Flood control tunnel failure is imminent. I'm sending photo captures of the marked schematics. Get Dr. Moore on the line and compare them against current county layouts. A beat. Then Maria, all command now. Understood? Send everything. Ethan photographed the maps and transmitted them over the emergency data burst. Weak connection. Slow transfer. Rain battered the roof harder. Shadow moved to the rear wall and growled. Ethan turned. A new sound had joined the storm. A deep, distant metal groan carrying upward through the building from somewhere below. Not random, mechanical strain. Ethan keyed the radio again. You're running out of time down there, Maria answered, lower now. Lena's here. Dr. Lena Moore's voice came on a second later, quiet and focused, even through interference. I'm looking at the schematics. Tell me where the maintenance route starts. Papers shuffled on the other end. Keys tapped. If these notes are right, the primary service stair beneath the relay station still connects to the old east bypass. It was sealed after the retrofit, but not fully removed. Her voice changed slightly as understanding set in. Ethan, if the pressure readings Mercer marked match current runoff models, the gate housing won't just fail. It'll shear. How long? I don't know yet. Best estimate. Silence for 2 seconds. Then, if the storm keeps feeding the reservoir at current rate, maybe 3 hours. Less if one of the upstream choke points gives way. Ethan looked at Shadow. The dog was already at the back corridor, staring into darkness. I'm going down. Maria cut in at once. Negative. You hold position until Reed gets up there. Ethan's answer came without heat. If Reed starts now, he loses 40 minutes on the road alone. By then we might not have a valley left. Maria knew it. He knew she knew it. That was the problem. Cole, there's no time. Static swallowed the first half of her reply. What remained was sharp, unwilling, and final. Then you keep comms open. No freelancing. You find the shaft. You report before entry. Understood. He took the flashlight and moved to the back corridor. Shadow slipped ahead. The corridor door was hidden behind a fallen equipment rack. Together, Ethan and the dog squeezed past it into a narrower service hall, lined with conduit, dead pipes, and peeling hazard tape. At the far end stood a steel hatch set into the floor, half concealed beneath years of debris. The keycard Mercer had left fit the reader on the first try. The hatch lock released with a heavy internal thunk. When Ethan pulled it open, a spiral stair descended into blackness. Cold air surged upward, carrying the raw scent of rock, rust, and moving water far below. Shadow looked back once. Ethan clipped the flashlight to his vest, adjusted the radio mic near his collar, and started down. The stair vibrated under his boots as if the whole mountain had a heartbeat. Down and down they went, circling through dim concrete and ancient support beams while the storm faded into a muffled roar overhead. Water stains streaked the walls. Old stenciled numbers marked levels that no longer meant much to anyone living. At the first landing, Ethan found the initial route marker exactly where Mercer had promised it would be. 2 diagonal lines carved into the paint near a rusted junction box. He touched the mark with his fingertips. Mercer had made this path for him. Not metaphorically, not in memory, literally. Every mark a message sent forward in case the worst happened. At the next landing, Shadow froze. The dog's body stiffened, nose lifted. Ethan stopped beside him and listened. A crack, then a low crumble of loose stone from somewhere ahead. He angled his light down the next section and saw that a portion of the stair wall had split, leaving chunks of concrete across the lower steps. Water seeped through the fracture in silvery threads. Ethan crouched, studied the break, then chose the outer side where the support looked strongest. Easy. Shadow waited for the signal, then descended exactly where Ethan pointed, placing each paw with uncanny precision. Ethan followed. At the bottom of the stair, the maintenance route opened into a tunnel barely wide enough for 2 people shoulder to shoulder. Old utility lamps along the ceiling were dead, but Mercer had placed reflective tape arrows at each change in direction, faintly visible in Ethan's flashlight beam. He kept moving. Maria updated from above in clipped intervals, road washouts on the west side, low-level evacuation alerts near the Creek District. Deputy Reed attempting to bring portable generators to the south intake station. Lena fed him structural advice as she correlated Mercer's notes with archived county records. The east bypass should split in 2 about a quarter-mile in, she said. If the ceiling sag in the map is accurate, take the left branch. The right side was probably reinforced later, which means if it's failing, it'll fail big. Copy. Shadow's nails clicked against wet concrete. His breathing remained controlled. Occasionally he glanced back, reading Ethan the way he always had, checking pace, tension, intent. It was not obedience, not exactly. It was partnership refined beyond language. The tunnel curved. Ahead, Ethan found the split Lena had predicted. The right branch looked cleaner, straighter, safer. The left was lower, darker, and carried a thin trickle of water across the floor. Mercer's reflective tape arrow pointed left. Ethan did not hesitate. They entered the narrower passage. The air grew colder. The vibration underfoot intensified. Every so often, Ethan passed handwritten warnings scratched into paint marker on the wall. Void under floor. Keep to pipe side. Do not run water noise. Hides fractures. He absorbed each instruction, body settling into an old operational rhythm he had not felt so cleanly in years. Assess, commit, move. The part of him that civilian life never fully needed had awakened, not in anger, but in clarity. This was the strange mercy of crisis. It stripped life back to essentials. There was no room for drifting in a tunnel that might collapse. Up ahead, Shadow abruptly turned sideways, blocking Ethan's path. What? The dog stared at the floor. Ethan lowered the flashlight. A section of concrete, roughly 6 feet across, had darkened differently than the rest. The surface hair-lined with nearly invisible fractures. Water pulsed beneath it. Hollow. Shadow did not move. Ethan stepped back, scanned the wall, and saw an old supply pipe anchored waist-high along the left side. He tested it. Stable enough. He clipped a short utility tether from his belt to the pipe bracket, then to Shadow's harness. Stay on me. He shifted his weight onto the wall-side edge, gripping the pipe, and crossed slowly. The concrete flexed once with a sickening softness beneath his boot. He kept going, reached the far side, turned. Shadow. The dog came immediately, body low, paws placing with exact balance. Midway across, the slab cracked with a sharp report. Ethan grabbed the harness handle and hauled as Shadow lunged. The slab dropped behind them in a crash of broken concrete and black water. The sound rolled through the tunnel like a gunshot. Ethan pressed one hand to the dog's ribs, steadying both of them. Good boy. Shadow leaned hard against his leg for 1 second, then turned forward again. No panic, only mission. They moved on. Above ground, the storm worsened. Captain Maria Hayes stood inside the mobile command trailer parked behind the sheriff's annex and watched the valley map fill with red advisories. She was in her mid-40s, dark hair pinned back, rain jacket unzipped and over duty gear, expression composed in the hard-earned way of people who knew panic was contagious and therefore forbidden. Through the trailer windows, emergency lights pulsed blue and amber across wet asphalt. Creek District notified, Lucas reported from the radio table, his voice tighter than he wanted it to sound. Deputy Lucas Reed was younger than the others by nearly a decade, all quick movement and restless competence. On most days, his energy brought lightness into rooms that needed it. Tonight it was being burned down into focus. Maria looked toward him. South Road? Half gone. I got County Public Works trying to lay temporary barriers, but if the reservoir blows, barriers won't matter. Lena stood hunched over a spread of digital and paper schematics, her face lit by 2 monitors and the occasional flash of lightning beyond the trailer. Brilliant, introspective, and so deep in concentration that she seemed to disappear inside the problem, Dr. Lena Moore had been pulled from the county forensic lab because she understood systems the way some people understood language. She did not just see data. She saw behavior. She tapped Mercer's old diagram. He was right. Maria turned. How bad? Lena zoomed in on a pressure simulation. Worse than anyone guessed. The diversion gate at the main control shaft isn't just jammed. Look at this housing geometry. Once the surge crosses threshold, the pressure will force all remaining flow into the weakest tunnel seam. If Ethan can free the gate before total lock, we divert enough volume into the spill corridor to spare the town. And if he can't? Lena did not answer immediately. That was answer enough. Maria keyed Ethan's channel. Cole, status. The response came through static and rushing echo. Advancing through East Bypass, 1 floor failure behind us. No injuries. Maria closed her eyes once in relief she did not show. You are not expendable, Ethan. After a pause, his reply came. Didn't say I was. Lucas looked away, giving the sentence the privacy it somehow deserved. Back in the mountain, Ethan reached a chamber where the tunnel ceiling rose high enough to swallow the flashlight beam. Massive old pipes crossed above him like the bones of something prehistoric. Water thundered somewhere deeper within the rock, louder now, constant and angry. On the far wall, Mercer had left another marker, and beneath it, something else. A battery lantern. Dead now, but carefully wedged on a crate beside a sealed envelope. Ethan opened it. Inside was one handwritten page. If you made it this far, you're ahead of where I was when the ceiling came down on the north service ramp. Good, means you still have options. Main rule from here, trust Shadow over the tunnel. Dogs read pressure before instruments do. If he refuses a path, there's a reason. Don't argue with him. You always were stubborn. At the bottom, smaller. Sorry I didn't make it easy. Didn't think I'd run out of time? Ethan folded the page once and tucked it inside his vest. He stared at the darkness beyond the chamber. Running out of time. That was the phrase everything came back to. In war, in storms, in friendship, in regret. The world rarely ended when people expected it to. It ended when delay finally used up all available mercy. Shadow had already found the next route, a narrow maintenance hatch low in the wall. Ethan dropped to one knee and shone the light through. The crawl space beyond descended steeply, barely large enough for a man in gear. Lena came over the radio. Ethan, based on the chamber shape you just described, you're directly above the relay branch. The control shaft should be below and southeast, but the nearest vertical access on the archive map was sealed after the retrofit. Ethan stared at the hatch. Mercer found another way. Shadow slipped into the opening without hesitation. Ethan followed. The crawl space forced him onto elbows and knees. Cold water soaked through his gloves. The sound of rushing pressure became almost physical, a force in the air. Several times the space narrowed so badly his shoulders scraped concrete. Shadow kept moving ahead, black shape and collar light flickering in darkness. Then the passage widened abruptly and dumped them into a cylindrical service shaft with a ladder bolted down one side. Half the ladder was bent away from the wall. Far below, water churned in darkness. Ethan keyed the radio. "I've got vertical access. Ladder compromised." Maria came back at once. "Then stop. Wait for Reed." Lucas cut in from another channel, wind roaring behind him. "I'm 5 minutes from the upper spill station. We may be able to pressure cycle the housing remotely if Lena can sync the sequence." Lena answered, already working. "Maybe, only if the gate isn't fully pinned." Ethan looked down the shaft. The flashlight caught a faded stencil near the bottom, main control. He said, "I'm not close enough to do anything from here." Maria's voice hardened. "I'm ordering you to hold." Shadow began descending, not recklessly, carefully, testing each bent rung before shifting weight. Ethan watched him go, saw the dog pause halfway, and look up as if asking why they were still talking. A muscle moved in Ethan's jaw. "Captain," he said quietly, with respect. "No." Before she could answer, he clipped into the ladder safety line, tested the first rung, and followed Shadow down. Metal groaned under their combined progress. Once a lower rung tore loose and fell, vanishing into water with no audible splash, swallowed by noise. Ethan shifted his weight, caught himself, kept going. By the time they reached the bottom platform, his forearms burned from tension. The main control chamber sprawled before them like the inside of a drowned machine. Huge wheel valves, rusted catwalks, pressure gauges pinned deep into red. Water blew in fine cold mist from a cracked seam high in the wall. On the far side of the chamber, partly obscured by steam and shadow, stood the diversion gate assembly, a vertical slab of reinforced metal lodged in heavy tracks. It was not merely jammed. It was fused in place by pressure and neglect. Shadow barked once, sharp and urgent, then turned toward a small adjacent alcove. Ethan followed the beam of his light. There, propped against the wall beside an emergency toolbox, was another recorder, and next to it a bent county helmet bearing Mercer's call sign in fading paint. For the first time that night, Ethan stopped moving entirely. The alcove floor was scarred, freshly compared to the rest. Scuffs, tool marks, traces of old dried mineral residue where water had once surged through at force. Mercer had been here, not in theory, here, in this chamber, alone. Ethan picked up the recorder and pressed play. Mercer's breathing hit first, closer this time, rough, strained. "East bypass failed," the voice said. "North ramp gone. I got the manual housing partially cleared, but the primary release arm won't move from this side. If you're hearing this, I never made it back up." A loud metallic impact sounded in the background. Mercer continued anyway. "Listen, the gate isn't dead. It's pinned by debris and counterpressure. You have to vent the side chambers first, or the main arm will never break free. Left valve bank, then lower crank assembly. Then the release lever at the shaft mouth." He coughed. When he spoke again, the voice had shifted from instruction to confession. "I kept meaning to call you. Every time I thought, one more day, one more repair, one more chance to fix it myself. You know how that goes." A weak laugh. "Guess you knew me too well." Ethan stared at the floor. The recorder crackled. "I talked about this valley so much, I probably ruined it for you before you ever saw it. But I wasn't lying. It mattered to me. Still does. If you came back for this, then I was right about one thing." A pause. "You're still the man I trusted when things got bad." Water roared louder behind the voice. "Don't let this place die because I ran out of time." The recording ended. No heroic goodbye. No speech about sacrifice. Just a job left unfinished by a man who knew exactly who would understand that weight. Shadow pressed close to Ethan's side, body angled inward. Ethan lowered his head for 1 second. Just one. The kind of second that contains all the grief a man cannot afford to unpack. Then he opened his eyes again, and the soldier, the officer, the protector, the friend, they aligned. He rose and crossed to the left valve bank. "Lena, I've got Mercer's sequence." He repeated it. She checked it against the schematics. "That should work," she said, "if the lower crank isn't seized solid. If it is, then you'll have to free it manually." Lucas came through, breathless. "Upper spill station online. I've got one portable generator feeding the old panel. Say when." Maria's voice followed. "Ethan, you're at the point of no easy return. I need a real status." He looked around the chamber, at the mist, the shaking catwalk, the gate holding back a mountain. Real status? This place is about to come apart. Silence on the radio, then Maria, softer and stronger at the same time, then finish it. Ethan set the recorder in a dry recess above the valve bank. "All right," he said. The first valve required both hands and all his weight. Rust screamed as the wheel turned a fraction, then another. Shadow paced the chamber edge, ears pinned toward the tunnel mouths, reading pressures Ethan could not measure. When the valve finally rotated open, a side vent exploded with spray, and the whole room shuddered. "One," Ethan said. The second valve was lower and harder, half submerged near a grated trench where freezing water surged around his boots. He dropped to a knee, braced, and cranked until his shoulder felt close to tearing. The wheel finally moved. "Two!" Over the radio, Lena's voice sharpened. "Pressure is shifting. Good, very good. But fast, Ethan. Whatever was holding upstream is weakening." The lower crank assembly sat across the chamber beneath a twisted catwalk support. Ethan ran. Shadow barked furiously. Halfway there, a section of overhead conduit snapped loose and crashed where Ethan had just been. He swerved, hit the floor hard, rolled, came up on one knee. Shadow was already beside him. "You called it," Ethan muttered. He reached the crank. It was a waist-high emergency gearbox with a fold-out iron handle, nearly immobile under strain. Ethan pulled the handle open and began turning. Nothing. He reset his stance and drove every ounce of weight through it. Still nothing. On the radio, Lucas said, "Come on, come on." Ethan ignored him, not out of disrespect, out of necessity. He adjusted, found the microscopic degree of slack buried beneath the lock, and hit it again. The mechanism shifted with a brutal jolt that sent pain through both wrists. Then it began to turn. Water pressure changed instantly. The chamber lights, dead for years, flickered once from emergency backfeed somewhere in the system. A deep hydraulic clunk rolled through the shaft. Lena almost shouted, "That's it! Main arm should be loose enough now." Ethan spun toward the final release position at the shaft mouth. It lay across a narrow catwalk above a vertical drop where black water churned 30 feet below. Half the handrail was gone. Mist coated the metal in slick silver. Shadow moved first. "No," Ethan said, too late. The dog crossed low and sure, harness light flashing through steam. Ethan followed more carefully, one hand on the surviving rail, boots finding purchase on the grid as the mountain shook around them. Midway across, the chamber gave a sound Ethan would never forget. A booming crack from deep within the rock, followed by a surge so violent the entire shaft belched upward like an animal struck in the spine. Water blasted through a side breach. The catwalk snapped. For one frozen instant, Ethan was no longer standing on steel. Then Shadow hit him. Not by accident, not chaos. Deliberate force, hard enough to drive Ethan's torso toward the remaining support beam instead of the open drop. Ethan slammed into metal, one arm catching the broken railing. His lower body swung out over darkness. The radio ripped from his collar and vanished. Shadow landed on the far side of the brake, claws scraping, body flat, harness tether line still clipped to Ethan's belt from the earlier crossing because Ethan had never bothered to remove it. The dog held. Ethan's shoulder screamed. Below him, water roared through the shaft. He got one boot against twisted steel, then another, and hauled himself up far enough to throw his chest across the broken catwalk edge. Shadow strained backward with every ounce of his weight, silent except for a harsh breath between teeth. Ethan dragged himself onto the platform and grabbed Shadow by the harness. For a second they stayed locked there, foreheads almost touching in spray and noise. "Not leaving me," Ethan said hoarsely. Shadow shoved into him once, as if offended by the idea. The final release lever stood only yards away now. Ethan rose. Without the radio, he could no longer hear Maria or Lena or Lucas. The chamber had become pure physical reality. Sound, pressure, metal, water, breath. Somewhere above, the surface team would either trust the sequence or not. Down here, the rest belonged to him and the dog. He crossed the last section and reached the lever housing. It was bigger than he expected, chest high, locked under a corroded emergency restraint chain. Mercer must have been unable to break alone. Ethan tore at the chain, got no movement, found the release pin half bent inside the housing latch, and kicked the metal casing until it cracked. He jammed a pry bar from the emergency kit into the opening and leveraged with all his weight. The pin gave. The chain dropped away. Now only the lever remained. It was a massive steel arm set in a notched bracket, frozen halfway between positions. Ethan wrapped both hands around it and pulled. Nothing. He reset, braced one boot against the housing, and pulled again until veins stood out in his forearms and breath burned in his throat. Still nothing. He looked at the gate assembly beyond the shaft. Water hammered against it from the mountainside in relentless force. Mercer had bought the valley months. Ethan was buying it seconds. Maybe that was all duty ever was, taking the next unbearable piece and carrying it anyway. He thought of Mercer on a ship deck under starlight, talking about clean air and quiet roads. Thought of every conversation that had felt hypothetical when life was generous and suddenly became binding when life stopped negotiating. Thought of all the ways he had drifted since loss, mistaking endurance for purpose. Then Shadow barked. One sharp blast right at him. Move! Ethan set his teeth and pulled a third time, not with anger, but with total commitment. The lever broke free, at first only an inch, then 6. Then all at once, the entire mechanism slammed downward with explosive force. Across the chamber, the diversion gate lurched. Metal screamed against metal. The slab shuddered upward in its tracks, resisted, then rose farther as trapped pressure found a new path. For half a second, Ethan thought it might hold. Then the wall behind the housing ruptured. Water detonated into the chamber. It hit Ethan like a truck. The world disappeared into freezing violence. He was underwater, then against steel, then spinning, hands clawing for anything fixed. The flashlight tore free. Darkness turned total, except for the red emergency glow pulsing somewhere high above. Water filled his ears, his nose, his mouth. He crashed against a support column hard enough to burst white light behind his eyes. Shadow. The thought cut through everything. Ethan surfaced in a maelstrom of spray and debris, gasping. The chamber was flooding fast, but the gate had moved. He could hear it, the changed tone of the system, the massive redirected roar funneling toward the spill corridor instead of into the valley line. Shadow emerged on the remains of the catwalk 10 feet away, fighting the current, trying to get to him. Here! The dog launched. Ethan caught the harness handle as another surge tore through the chamber. Together they were thrown against the ladder base at the service shaft wall. Ethan wrapped one arm through the steel rung and held Shadow tight against him until the worst of the current passed. They could not stay. The chamber would fill completely, or collapse, maybe both. Ethan looked up the shaft. The ladder remained, bent, slick. Possible. He began climbing. Every motion felt heavier than the last. Wet gloves slipped. Boots searched blindly for damaged rungs. Shadow climbed beside and sometimes above him, using angles and broken supports a human body could not. Once Ethan's foot missed and his weight dropped violently onto one arm. Pain shot from shoulder to spine. He grunted, recovered, kept going. Near the midpoint, the ladder tore loose from one anchor bolt. The whole line swung 6 inches away from the wall. Ethan slammed into concrete. Shadow scrambled, found new purchase, stayed with him. Above them, a faint rectangle of lighter darkness marked the shaft exit. He climbed toward it as if it were the only thing left in the world. By the time they reached the top access tunnel, Ethan was shaking from cold and exertion. He pulled himself over the lip and collapsed to both hands. Shadow emerged beside him, drenched, sides heaving. For several seconds, neither moved. Then the tunnel behind them gave a deep cracking boom. Ethan didn't need translation. Go! They ran, not blindly, never blindly. Ethan followed Mercer's markers back through the maintenance route while the mountain failed in stages behind them. One tunnel wall split and sprayed a fan of water across the passage. Another section dropped chunks of ceiling that shattered where they had been seconds earlier. Shadow kept ranging ahead, then back, choosing safe ground by instinct and perception beyond Ethan's own. At the chamber with the broken floor slab, the gap had widened, too far to step safely in soaked gear. Ethan backed up 2 paces, measured, then jumped, landed hard on the far edge, nearly slipped, caught the wall pipe. Turned. Shadow didn't wait for instruction. He sprang cleanly across, hit Ethan in the chest, and drove them both into the wall instead of backward into the drop. They kept moving. At the spiral stair, Ethan grabbed the handrail and hauled upward. The tunnel vibrations had become constant now, less like isolated strain and more like the whole mountain exhaling damage. Somewhere far off, sirens began echoing faintly from the valley below. Surface team, still there, still fighting. He reached the relay station hatch and pushed into the corridor beyond just as emergency lights flickered alive overhead for 3 pulses, then died again. The operations room came next, the storm beyond the entrance door, rain, wind, night. He stumbled outside with Shadow at his side. The mountain gave one final groan behind them, and part of the relay station roof collapsed inward in a burst of concrete dust and sparks. Ethan made it 3 steps into the yard before his knees failed. He caught himself on one hand in the mud. Shadow stood over him, barking into the storm. Once, twice, 3 times. Headlights appeared beyond the gate. A truck skidded to a stop on the gravel shelf. Deputy Lucas Reed jumped out before the engine fully died, rain plastering his hair to his forehead. "Ethan!" Lucas reached him first. A second vehicle followed, and Captain Maria Hayes was out of it in seconds, boots splashing through runoff. Dr. Lena Moore came behind her carrying a thermal blanket and a field med kit, though her eyes went first not to Ethan's injuries, but to the mountain itself, listening, calculating, confirming. Maria crouched in front of Ethan. "Talk to me." He looked past her down the slope toward the valley. At first all he saw was darkness and storm. Then, far below, something changed. A new white torrent burst from the eastern spill corridor, cut into the mountainside, roaring away from the town and into the sacrificial flood basin beyond the ridge. Not toward homes, not toward Main Street. Away. The diversion. It had held. Lena saw it too and breathed out for what might have been the first time in an hour. "He did it," Lucas laughed once, half disbelieving and half relief. "He actually did it." Maria looked back at Ethan, rain running down her face. She knew better than to praise him with anything big or sentimental in that moment. He would reject it. So she said the only thing that fit. "Good work, officer." Ethan looked at Shadow. The dog stood in the rain, chest lifted, sides still pumping, eyes fixed on Ethan, as if waiting for the next order. Ethan managed the ghost of a smile. "Good work, partner." Shadow stepped forward and pressed his head against Ethan's shoulder. The storm went on for another 2 hours. The danger did not vanish all at once. Roads remained flooded, creek beds overswelled, power failed across 3 blocks of town. But the catastrophic break never came. The reservoir bled safely into the spill corridor, the south tunnel survived, and by dawn the valley still stood where it had stood the day before. At sunrise, the rain finally weakened to a cold mist. The mountains emerged slowly, dark green and stone gray beneath torn clouds. Down in town, mud lined the roads and debris was everywhere, but people were alive. Homes still stood. Storefront windows reflected a battered but intact morning. Ethan watched the first light from a folding chair outside the command trailer, wrapped in a blanket he had not asked for. His shoulder was strapped. His knuckles were split. There was dried blood at one temple from when the column had caught him in the chamber. He looked like a man who had gone a few rounds with geology and not entirely lost. Shadow lay at his feet, exhausted but unwilling to be far. Maria stepped out of the trailer with a paper cup of coffee and held it toward Ethan. He took it with a nod. For a while they said nothing. The valley breathed around them. Engines, radios, boots in wet gravel, distant voices doing the work that followed surviving. Eventually Maria said, "Lena confirmed the gate is stable. Temporary, but stable. County engineers are already asking how a condemned station and a dead survey officer were more prepared than the rest of their department." Ethan looked into the steam rising off the coffee. Mercer knew how to see what people didn't want to see. Maria studied him. "You want to talk about him?" "No." A lesser leader might have pushed. She didn't. Instead, she said, "He trusted the right man." Ethan didn't answer that either, but something in his face shifted. Not open, not broken, just less locked than before. Lucas approached from the far side of the lot, carrying 2 wrapped breakfast sandwiches and looking as if he had been awake for a week. He held one up toward Ethan. "Peace offering from the diner. Also, I was told if I tried to eat both, Captain Hayes would write me up for moral failure." Maria took hers without expression. "Accurate." Lucas handed Ethan the other and then crouched to offer a piece of plain egg from his own to Shadow, who accepted it with solemn dignity. "I'm just saying," Lucas went on, rubbing the dog's ears, "if we're rebuilding anything out of this, he gets his own office." "Bigger than yours," Lena said as she joined them, carrying a tablet full of damage assessments. Lucas pointed at her. "See? Finally, institutional wisdom." Lena's mouth curved faintly. Exhaustion softened her reserve, making the warmth beneath it easier to see. She glanced toward Ethan. "I reviewed Mercer's notes again. He wasn't only documenting failures, he'd started redesign sketches for the relay site." Ethan looked up. "Redesign for what?" She turned the tablet so he could see. On the screen were scanned pages from the notebooks found in the case, clean drawings, practical annotations, supply lists, route tables. Maria leaned in. Lucas frowned. "Is that kennel space?" Lena nodded. "Not just kennel space, search and rescue staging, emergency comms, avalanche gear, medical lockers, access to the old tunnel observation points. He wanted the station repurposed, not abandoned." Ethan took the tablet. Mercer's handwriting ran beside one of the sketches. "If the valley's going to keep trusting the mountain, it needs a team built for when the mountain answers back." Below that, in smaller script, "Cole and a good dog would love this place. He'll complain first." Despite himself, Ethan let out a low breath that almost became laughter. Maria saw it. So did Lena. Lucas grinned openly. "What?" Lucas said. "Dead guy knew you." Ethan handed the tablet back carefully. His gaze drifted toward the damaged relay station on the ridge above them, barely visible through thinning cloud. Hours ago it had been a grave of unfinished duty. Now, because Mercer had planned beyond fear and because the town had survived, it looked like the beginning of something else. Not a memorial. A use. A mission. By afternoon, county officials were already talking budgets, inspections, liability, emergency authorizations. Most of it was noise. Maria handled the politics with the cold precision of someone born to translate urgency into bureaucracy without losing her patience. Lena compiled engineering evidence no one could dismiss. Lucas coordinated volunteers and equipment transfers with enough enthusiasm to power half the valley himself. Ethan, once cleared by the medic to stand without falling over, returned to the station site with Shadow and helped mark the sections too unstable for crews to enter. He moved differently now, still quiet, still controlled. But the old heaviness that had long sat beneath his calm no longer seemed like dead weight. It had direction. Over the next weeks, the condemned relay station changed. Storm debris was cleared first. Then the collapsed roof section was stripped away. New support steel arrived on flatbeds. Temporary communications equipment went in, while the old operations room was gutted to concrete and rebuilt. One side of the structure became a response bay with racks for ropes, thermal drones, rescue sleds, medical packs, and field radios. Another became kennel and training space designed around Shadow's size and work habits because Ethan refused to let anyone build dog space without practical input, and Shadow rejected impractical design with total contempt. Lucas contributed opinions constantly. Most were unnecessary. A few were useful. Lena reworked Mercer's original sketches into buildable plans, improving them without erasing his intent. Maria pushed the county board until funding was approved under emergency resilience measures. Ethan supervised more than he spoke, repairing what needed repair, testing what needed testing, and staying on site so often that by the second month, everyone stopped asking if he intended to go home before dark. Shadow was home. Wherever Ethan worked with purpose, Shadow settled. Summer came to the valley in stages. Snow vanished from the high cuts. The pines brightened. Creek water ran clear again. Wildflowers pushed up along the road to the ridge. Below, town life regained its normal shape. School traffic, open diner windows, trucks at the hardware store, evening lights across porches. But above town, on the mountain shelf where the station stood, something newly permanent was taking root. On the day the sign went up, the sky was blue enough to feel almost ceremonial. Lucas stood below the ladder holding the bolts, making entirely too many comments for a man trusted near tools. Lena checked the mounting alignment twice from the ground. Maria folded her arms and pretended not to care about aesthetic details while caring very much. Ethan secured the final bracket. Then he climbed down and stepped back beside Shadow. The sign was simple: Mercer Ridge, Search and Rescue, K-9 Response Unit. Silence settled over the small group. Not awkward silence, respectful silence. Lucas was the first to break it, as Lucas almost always was. I still think Shadow Headquarters had stronger branding. Maria gave him a flat look. And yet here we are. Lena's gaze stayed on the sign. He would have hated the attention. Ethan nodded once. Probably. But he'd have liked the function, Maria said. That was true. A week later, function arrived. A storm front, not as violent as the spring one, but sharp enough to matter, rolled unexpectedly over the western trail system just before dusk. A hiker's emergency locator activated somewhere above the ravine line. 2 years earlier, response in those conditions would have been improvised. That night it was immediate. Maria ran command from the station operations room. Lena pulled topographic overlays and weather movement. Lucas drove the trailhead route vehicle. Ethan geared up in silence while Shadow circled once, fully alert, sensing work before the first command was spoken. They found the hiker before night closed completely, alive, pinned on a rock shelf below a collapsed footbridge, leg fractured, exposure setting in. Shadow located him first through rain and wind and the smell of wet cedar. Ethan descended the slope on rope line, secured the man, and brought him up with Lucas while Maria coordinated med transfer and Lena kept track of the shifting weather cell. On the drive back down the mountain, with the rescued man stabilizing in the rear and Shadow seated like a carved guardian beside the stretcher, Ethan looked through the windshield at the valley lights and understood something with unusual clarity. Mercer had not only left him a warning, he had left him a direction. Not an obligation chained to death, but a path anchored in service. Finish what matters. Protect what can still be protected. Stay where the work is real. It was the opposite of drifting. That autumn, the station became part of the valley's identity. School kids visited on field days to watch Shadow demonstrate scent tracking. Ranchers on the outer roads stopped by with coffee and weather reports. Search grids were mapped. Emergency drills were run. Equipment checks became ritual. Lucas continued trying to teach Shadow handshakes with no success whatsoever. Lena gradually started smiling more during station briefings, though only people who knew her well would have noticed. Maria, pragmatic as ever, pretended all of it had happened because she had planned it perfectly from the beginning. Ethan let her have that. At dusk, when shifts quieted and the mountain wind moved through the pines, he sometimes stood outside near the fence line with Shadow and looked over the valley Mercer had once described to him from half a world away. He no longer felt like a visitor in it. One evening in late October, long after the last volunteer truck had gone and the ridges were turning black against a violet sky, Ethan sat on the station steps with a maintenance rag in one hand and Shadow stretched beside him on the concrete, head on paws. Inside, Lucas was still arguing with the coffee maker. Lena was entering field inventory. Maria was on a call with county administrators she would certainly outlast. The air smelled of cold rock and pine and distant wood smoke from town. Ethan took the old recorder from his jacket pocket. He had carried it for months. Not because he needed to replay it every day, because some things deserved wait. He pressed play. Mercer's voice came on softly in the mountain dusk. "If you're hearing this, you made it to the station." Same voice, same rough humor. But now the sentence no longer felt like an ambush from the dead. It felt like a bridge. Pain still lived in it. So did gratitude. Shadow lifted one ear at the sound. Ethan listened all the way through. When the recording ended, he looked out over the valley and spoke into the quiet, not because he believed the dead were waiting for speeches, but because some promises deserved to be answered aloud. "I got here late," he said. Wind moved through the trees, but I got here. Shadow's tail thumped once against the step. Lights from town flickered below like scattered embers. Behind Ethan, the station hummed with ordinary human activity. Boots, drawers, quiet voices, the unremarkable sounds of a place being used for exactly what it was built to do. Not frozen in memory, alive in duty. Ethan rested a hand on Shadow's neck. For years he had mistaken survival for enough. Keep moving, keep your head down, get through the night. It was a hard habit to unlearn, especially for men built around endurance. But a life could survive and still remain unclaimed. The difference, he now understood, was purpose. Purpose was not a feeling. It was a direction chosen repeatedly. The mountain had nearly drowned the valley. Mercer had nearly carried the weight alone. Ethan had nearly let grief remain a sealed room in himself the way he had with so many other losses. But the storm had forced everything open. The danger, the promise, the unfinished work, even the love buried beneath restraint. Inside the station, Lucas suddenly shouted, "Captain, I swear this machine hates me personally." Maria's reply came back dry and immediate. "That makes two of us." Lena laughed, a quick, unexpected sound. Ethan smiled. Shadow lifted his head and looked at him, eyes dark and intelligent in the fading light, as if confirming what had changed. "Yes," Ethan said quietly, "I know." The first winter after the station opened came early. Snow rimed the fence rails in silver. The valley roofs turned white. Morning briefings happened with steam rising from coffee cups and Shadow's breath visible in the air. The station handled avalanche calls, stranded motorists, and one lost child who was found 3 miles from home because Shadow caught a mitten scent line after sunset and refused to quit until Ethan did. He never did. By then the valley knew their names, not in the loud, heroic way cities sometimes manufacture after disaster. In the steadier way, small places learn who shows up when it matters. People trusted the station because they had seen the result of duty carried all the way through. On the anniversary of the storm, Maria organized nothing formal. That had been deliberate. No speeches, no ribbon event, no officials pretending they had stood where others had stood. Instead, the 4 of them ended shift early and drove up to the overlook above the spill corridor with Shadow in the back and a battered thermos of diner coffee Lucas insisted was ceremonial grade. The basin below was calm now, green at the edges, harmless in spring light. They stood together at the railing, Maria with her pragmatic strength, Lena with her inward intelligence, Lucas with his restless loyalty, Ethan with the same reserve he had always worn, though now it no longer hid a void. Shadow beside him, large and steady, gaze moving from face to horizon to valley, as though keeping watch over all of it. Lucas broke the silence first, naturally. "Not for nothing, but next year I vote for cake." Maria didn't look at him. "You vote for cake every year?" "Because I believe in traditions." Lena's eyes stayed on the basin. "He saved all of this." Ethan knew she meant Mercer. After a moment he said, "He started it." Maria looked toward Ethan. "And you finished it." He shook his head once. "We did." That answer mattered, because the truth of the night had grown larger than any one man descending into a shaft. Mercer had left the path. Ethan had walked it. Shadow had saved him on the catwalk, and again in the dark. Maria had held the town steady when fear could have broken it. Lena had seen the system clearly enough to make survival possible. Lucas had kept routes open, power running, hands moving. No one carried the valley alone. The wind shifted. Far below, sunlight struck the station roof and turned it briefly bright against the mountain. Ethan followed the light with his eyes and felt something rare and unforced settle in him. Peace. Not because pain had disappeared. It never entirely did. The dead did not return. The cost of the storm remained real. Memories remained real. But peace was not the absence of scars. It was knowing what the scars had become attached to. Service, place, people, work worth doing. Shadow leaned against Ethan's leg. Ethan rested his gloved hand on the dog's head. A year ago he had driven into a storm thinking he was checking a signal. He had no idea he was driving toward the moment his life would stop being defined by what had been lost and start being defined by what he was willing to protect. Below them, the valley carried on. Quiet roads, open storefronts, homes with smoke rising from chimneys, children going where children should be able to go without floodwater chasing them through the dark. Mercer had once called it the only place that ever felt like peace. Now Ethan understood why, because peace was never something a place simply possessed. It was something people defended, repaired, earned again when the world threatened to take it. And sometimes the ones who defended it did so with a badge, a steady hand, and a dog who never once looked away. Ethan stood there with his team and his partner, and the valley spread below. And for the first time in longer than he could name, the promise he carried no longer felt like a burden on his back. It felt like a hand at his shoulder, guiding him forward. He looked at the station on the ridge, at the mountain, at the life that had grown out of one terrible night. Then he said, quietly but with complete certainty, "We stay ready." Maria nodded. Lena nodded. Lucas straightened, suddenly serious. "Always." Shadow gave one low, steady bark into the spring air, and the sound carried out over the valley like an oath.